Dr. Night Echoes.
I used to work the night shift at a high-end pet hotel. It was usually an easy job. The animals had luxury glass suites, and by midnight, all 60 of them were usually fast asleep. At exactly 3 a.m., I was sitting in the break room when a sudden noise made me drop my phone. Every single dog in the building started screaming. It was not normal barking. It sounded like dozens of animals being hurt all at once, howling and scratching at the glass. The noise was so loud it shook the drywall. I assumed a pipe had burst or someone had broken into the main lobby. I ran down the hallway toward the kennel wing. The heavy, soundproof door was the only thing separating me from the noise. I could hear the muffled, frantic shrieking right through the thick metal. I grabbed the handle and threw the door open, ready to face whatever was happening. The second the latch clicked, the noise stopped. It did not fade out. 60 dogs did not just calm down because they saw me. It was instant, total silence, like a television being muted. I walked down the first row of suites, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked through the glass. A golden retriever that had been howling a second ago was curled up on his fleece bed, snoring softly. I checked the next suite and the next. Every single dog was in a deep sleep. Their breathing was slow and heavy. There were no wet noses against the glass, no wagging tails, and no signs of panic. They looked like they had been asleep for hours. I stood in the middle of the aisle, listening to 60 dogs breathe in perfect unison. Something had made them scream, and then something had made them pretend they never did. I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour grocery store in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The store was always dead around 3:30 a.m. I was sitting at the front desk, drinking stale coffee and staring at the black and white security monitors. On camera 4, a man in a gray hoodie was walking down the cereal aisle. His hands were in his pockets and his head was tilted down. I watched him approach the end of the row. Instead of turning left or right, he kept walking straight forward. He walked directly into a massive, heavy-duty metal shelving unit loaded with giant boxes of oatmeal. He did not crash. He did not knock anything over. His body just slid through the solid metal and the cardboard boxes like they were thin smoke. A second later, he emerged on the other side into the next aisle, completely normal, and just kept strolling along. My stomach dropped. I jumped up from my chair and ran straight to the back of the store. My boots clicked loudly on the linoleum. When I reached the aisle, the air felt incredibly cold. I grabbed the edge of the metal shelf and shook it with all my strength. It did not budge. It was bolted directly into the concrete floor and packed solid with stock. There was no gap, no hidden space, and absolutely no one there. I hurried back to the office and replayed the footage. I watched it 3 times. It showed the exact same thing every single time. His body merged with the solid metal, his torso disappearing first, then his legs. The boxes of food never even shifted a millimeter. I spent the rest of my shift staring at the front doors, terrified that he would walk back out the same way he came in. I was the night watchman for an old theater built in the late 1800s. The place was being renovated, so the crew had completely disconnected the power to the main stage area. The whole building was supposed to be pitch black and dead silent. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting in the lobby when I heard a faint, rhythmic sound. It sounded like a small group of people politely clapping their hands. The sound was coming directly from the main auditorium. I grabbed my flashlight and pushed through the heavy double doors. expecting to find teenagers who had snuck inside. Instead, I froze. The main stage was flooded with a bright, warm amber light. It was impossible. The breaker switches were completely pulled, and the massive vintage stage lamps above were unplugged. In the center of that bright circle of light stood a woman. She was wearing a heavy, dark, Victorian-style dress that looked dusty and worn. She was leaning forward, bowing gracefully to rows of empty, torn-out velvet seats. I took a step forward, my boots creaking on the floorboards. The sound made her stop. She slowly straightened her back and tilted her head up to look right at me. My breath caught in my throat. There were no eyes, there was no nose, and no mouth. Her face was just a flat, smooth piece of pale, featureless skin, like a blank mannequin head covered in flesh. The bright amber lights flickered once and snapped off, plunging the room into total darkness. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed the beam at the center stage. The woman was gone. The thick layer of construction dust on the wooden stage floor was completely smooth and undisturbed. There were no footprints. The only thing left behind was a sudden, freezing chill in the air that smelled faintly of old perfume. I worked the night shift at a hospital sleep lab, monitoring patients who have severe sleep disorders. My job is to sit in a small, dark control room behind a one-way glass wall, watching the live video feeds and listening to the audio coming from the patient rooms. One night, I was reviewing the audio track for a middle-aged man who had checked in because his wife claimed he talked in his sleep. He had been asleep for about 2 hours. On my monitor, his brainwaves were steady, and his chest was rising and falling in a deep, peaceful rhythm. The microphone in his room was picking up his soft, regular snoring. Then, the audio line crackled. The man did not stop snoring. He did not move a muscle, but a second voice came through my headphones. It was incredibly deep, gravelly, and wet. It sounded like someone was leaning down, putting their mouth right against the microphone capsule on the bedside table. The voice whispered, "He's almost done." The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I lunged forward and stared through the glass wall into his room, then quickly switched my monitor to the high-definition infrared camera feed. The room was completely empty. The door was locked from the inside. There was nobody standing by the bed, and there was nothing but empty air near the microphone. I replayed the audio file, turning the volume up. The patient's soft snorings were perfectly layered underneath that horrible, raspy whisper. It was physically impossible for one person to make both sounds at the same time. I sat there in the dark control room for the next 4 hours, staring at the screen, terrified to look away from the empty space next to his pillow. I used to work the late shift at a glass bottling plant. The factory floor was always incredibly loud, filled with the constant clinking of heavy bottles and the roar of conveyor belts. One night, the noise felt a bit muted, and I spent about 20 minutes chatting with an older guy named Bill. He was working the assembly station right next to mine. He seemed like a nice, ordinary person. He told me all about his grandkids, complained about his bad knee, and explained how the factory machines used to be totally different back in the day. He was wearing faded blue coveralls with a strange, dark grease stain shaped like a crescent moon right on the left shoulder. While we were talking, my supervisor walked down the aisle and tapped me on the shoulder. He asked me why I was slacking off and who exactly I was talking to. I turned and pointed straight at the older man. "Just talking to Bill here," I said. My supervisor stared at me, his face going completely pale. I looked back over my shoulder to look at Bill, but the station was completely empty. There was nobody there. The tools were sitting neatly on the metal bench, untouched. My supervisor grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the main office. He told me that no one had been assigned to that specific station for over 3 years. The last person to work there was a man named Bill, who had been crushed to death in a freak machinery accident right on that exact spot. Before I could even speak, my supervisor described him perfectly, right down to the crescent-shaped grease stain on his left shoulder. I worked the graveyard shift at an assisted living facility on the edge of town. It was usually quiet, except for room 214. The room had been completely vacant for about a month, ever since the previous resident, an elderly man, had passed away in his bed. Every single night, at exactly 3:22 a.m., the call light for room 214 would buzz and light up the main dashboard at the nurse's station. That was the exact time listed on the old man's death certificate. The first few times it happened, I figured it was just a faulty wire or a short circuit in the wall. I would walk down the dark hallway, step into the empty room, click the plastic reset button on the wall panel, and walk out. But it kept happening every single night. One Tuesday, I decided I was done being creeped out. At 3:15 a.m., I walked into room 214, closed the door behind me, and turned on my flashlight. The room was freezing cold and stripped bare. There was no mattress on the bed frame, just a naked metal grid. I stood right next to the bedside wall panel, staring directly at the red call button. I watched the digital clock on my phone flip to 3:22 a.m. The room went completely silent. Right in front of my face, the plastic red button physically clicked and sunk deep into the wall panel. It did not snap down like an electrical glitch. I watched the plastic compress slowly and firmly, exactly as if a heavy, invisible thumb was pressing down on it with force. The buzzer down the hall started ringing. I did not wait around to see what else was in that room. I bolted out the door and never went back inside. I used to do night security at a massive commercial shipping port. The place was a maze of towering cargo containers, rusted cranes, and pitch-black corners. During a massive rainstorm, the visibility was terrible. I was patrolling the docks when my flashlight beam caught a man about 50 yards ahead. He was wearing a bright yellow rain slicker with the hood pulled up, walking directly toward the edge of the deep water pier. The wind was howling, but I screamed at the top of my lungs for him to stop. That specific area was strictly restricted, and a fall into the choppy black water meant certain death. He did not slow down. He did not even turn his head to look at me. He just kept walking with a strange, stiff stride until he reached the concrete ledge and stepped right off into the open air. My heart shot into my throat. I grabbed a heavy plastic life ring from the nearest railing and sprinted to the edge, fully expecting to hear a massive splash or frantic screams for help. I shined my light down into the dark water. Nothing. The surface was completely undisturbed by a fall. There were no splashes, no white foam, and no ripples stretching out into the dark. It was like he had vanished before hitting the surface. Terrified and confused, I ran back to the guard shack to check the high-definition security footage. I pulled up the camera overlooking the pier and hit play. The tape showed me running like a madman, screaming into the wind and throwing the life ring into the ocean, but there was no one else on the screen. The camera showed absolutely nothing in front of me. I had been chasing empty air. I did night security for an old shopping mall that was being permanently decommissioned. Most of the storefronts were totally gutted and empty, but a few of the larger department stores still had old mannequins left behind. The place was creepy, silent, and smelled like dust. Around 1 a.m., I was walking my rounds when my flashlight beam hit something strange. A male mannequin in a faded gray suit was standing right in the middle of the main concourse, nowhere near any of the shops. I figured some local teenagers had snuck inside through a fire exit and moved it to mess with me. I grunted, grabbed the heavy plastic figure by its stiff torso, and dragged it back inside the empty department store where it belonged. 20 minutes later, I stepped out of the break room to start my next lap. My breath caught in my throat. The exact same mannequin was back out in the middle of the concourse, only this time it was not where I found it before. It was at least 10 feet closer to my security office, positioned directly at the end of the narrow hallway, facing my door. My hands started shaking. I ran back into the office and pulled up the digital control panel. The mall was equipped with state-of-the-art infrared motion sensors in every single zone. I checked the logs. Nothing had been tripped. The sensors showed absolute stillness in the concourse for the last hour. I locked the heavy security door, bolted the latch, and sat at the desk. I kept my eyes glued to the live monitor screen, watching that pale, plastic face in the dark corridor. It never moved a single inch for the rest of the night, but the way its blank, painted eyes were angled made it feel like it was staring directly through the camera lens, straight at me. I worked the late shift at a commercial bakery from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. For the first 4 hours of my shift, I was completely alone in the building. The back kitchen was lined with stainless steel refrigerators and massive industrial prep tables, which meant almost every surface acted like a mirror. Around 10 p.m., I was standing at a central table kneading a large batch of dough. As I pushed down on the flour, I caught sight of something in the reflection of the fridge door directly ahead of me. A tall man in a dark, well-tailored suit was standing right behind my back. I spun around instantly, expecting to see a manager or an early delivery driver. There was nobody there. The kitchen was completely empty. I rubbed my eyes, assuming the bright fluorescent lights were just playing tricks on my tired brain. 10 minutes later, I was still working on the dough. I looked up at the steel fridge again, and my heart completely stopped. He was back in the reflection, only this time he wasn't just standing behind me. He was leaning way over my right shoulder, his face positioned right next to mine, as if he were closely watching me work. The reflection was incredibly sharp. I could see the rough texture of his black suit fabric and the bright shine on his leather shoes. I turned around so fast my elbow knocked a heavy metal bowl of flour off the counter. It crashed to the floor, sending a white cloud into the air. The space behind me was totally empty. No footsteps, no opening doors, nothing. I didn't clean up the mess. I grabbed my phone, walked straight to the front of the shop, and spent the rest of my shift sitting by the display cases where the bright streetlights could reach me.